Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the new GeoPodcast of Geopolitical Cyprus.org. We have the pleasure to have with us today Dr. Kenan Sharpe. He has a PhD in literature from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and is working as a lecturer at Boğaziçi University, and is also an arts and culture columnist at Duvar English. Kenan, hello and welcome. We're very happy to have you.
Thanks so much for having me here.
We thought with everything that is going on, it would be a good opportunity to catch up and listen to your views and take on what is happening in Turkey and beyond maybe. So let me get right into it and ask you, we see the news about the COVID crisis all over the world, obviously, but also specifically in Turkey. And I would say that this crisis, along with the economic crisis, are probably two of the main issues, main problems right now in the country. And it so happens that I heard that perhaps the crisis with the pandemic is actually bigger than what the media lets us know. So how do you see all that playing out? What is society's reaction and perception of all that situation?
Yeah, as you just summarized, there's multiple crises kind of happening all at once. The COVID, the economy, and of course, constant things with foreign policy, as you guys know very well.
Obviously, yeah.
So I would say overall, things are quite grim in many ways. I mean, people are very much aware of what's happening with the economy. The lira has been losing value to some of its lowest points in recent months. So last week or so, since the firing of the economy minister, it's gotten a little bit better, but still, I remember 10 years ago, the lira was about, 1.5 to the dollar, and we reached about 10 recently. And that has a major effect, of course, not just on people who are going abroad or have business ties, but so many jobs are tied to foreign currency as well as debt and everything else. And with inflation rising, people really feel the crunch. So that is very much a thing people are intensely aware of. And I think the government's recent moves to try to make this a little bit better and at least make Turkey seem more appealing to investors, I think they're aware of how much discontent this can breed, because this really affects people's lives, the kind of things they're able to buy and bring home, food, not to mention more expensive goods that are imported from abroad, like phones, etc. So it affects everyone. And then, of course, like you said, that's compounded with what's going on with COVID. Like basically everywhere in the world, the situation is a little difficult in Turkey. It's the cases are rising every day to an astounding degree. We're very much in the midst of the second wave. There's stories of hospital beds running out in the major cities. Istanbul is definitely one of the epicenters of this crisis. And of course, we've learned that the government until recently was only reporting symptomatic cases, not unsymptomatic cases, as they're supposed to according to the World Health Organization standards. So there's a lot of, I think, a lack of trust in the government's numbers and what they're doing. Our health minister is constantly saying, obey the rules of social distancing, stay at home, etc. But there's been no serious attempt to create the means for people to actually stay at home and avoid getting infected or infecting others. So they're saying follow the rules and stay at home, but there's been no serious financial support or other ways to make that possible. So people are inevitably going to work, out in the streets, taking buses, everyone without the luxury of staying at home to work. So the situation is quite grim and getting worse, I would say.
Yanni, may I have a follow-up question?
Sure, Zenonas, go ahead.
Thank you. So just a couple of thoughts. What are the expectations from the new finance minister, if any? And what do you think, where do you think that the rising inflation and this economic crisis overall will push the society? Because there is talk about, the society getting tired, people are getting tired, as you described, things are grim. So do you expect that, leading to some reaction, demonstrations, maybe different attitudes in the next elections or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of inflation, I think the main issue and the economy in general, it's not my field, but you could see that the government's making attempts to, I think their big goal is to calm foreign investors and get the lira back down. And by firing the economy minister and actions like that, there's also been talk in the last couple of days about rehauling the justice system and to make things more fair, which are pretty much unconvincing. But I think a lot of this is for, for foreign capital to try to calm things and get things better. Because I think they're aware, like you just alluded to, that there's a major problem. And, the AKP has been in power for quite a long time now, nearly 2 decades. And, the kind of Achilles heel is of course the economy and the way that affects people's lives. And things are still quite polarized here, but if there's anything that's going to push the dial to another direction and perhaps lead to protests, it's if they continue to mishandle the economy. I think that's what can really have them lose popularity, because in the last elections, with many traumatic and difficult things happening in the country, the ruling party still wins about 50% of the votes roughly, and polls recently are showing that that support decreasing and decreasing. So I think either they're going to have to find a way to fix it, or they're going to see upheaval or losing in the elections potentially.
Giannis?
I would like to move to some issues I'm really interested to, and I know Kenan has a broad view and expertise among the so-called politics of resistance, the youth movement, cultural movements like the music subcultures, and all these dynamics that came out post-Gezi protests in 2013. And I would like to explain us in a few words all this big debate about the so-called Generation Z among the voters of the Turkish youth. What is your take about the new generations, all these millennials born after 1995 that are going to vote and have the right to elect for the first time in the upcoming elections? How this will affect Turkish politics in the upcoming years?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this generation, especially the Generation Z, the ones born after 1995, are going to be a major impact and are really a kind of bellwether of how Turkish society feels. I forget the exact percentage, but I think about by the time the next general elections are scheduled now for 2023, if that's not changed. And I think new voters or people who are Generation Z are going to make up something like 15% of the electorate. So a really hugely influential demographic. And like the things we talked about with COVID or the economy and many other issues, they're really upset. I mean, one of the government's main tactics it uses, its rhetorical moves, is to say we have an old Turkey that was repressive and not a major world power in this way, and the economy was much weaker and people couldn't even buy refrigerators, all this kind of stuff. But for people who are of the generation we're talking about, they've known basically no other government in power but the AKP. So they don't have a quote unquote old Turkey to compare the present to. So when they see, what they compare is their childhoods when Turkey was really moving up economically and the quality of life was growing to now, and they see how difficult it is to buy simple things. And unemployment, of course, is a major, major issue for them. This sense of people, young people who study, who go to, dedicate years of their life into trying to set themselves up for a career and realizing that there's no career to be had. The unemployment rate for people under 25 is really high. And the sense of despair and hopelessness, honestly, are also quite high. Even among AKP voters, young AKP voters right now, roughly 60% say they want to move abroad if given the opportunity. So we have this enormous brain drain of people either leaving or hoping to leave. 50% of young people say they're unhappy. I mean, these numbers are really quite astonishing. So this generation really will be influential and determine a lot of things, and they're really not content, not only with the economy, but also with basic freedoms. Surveys different organizations have done with young people say that freedom of speech is a major issue for them. The fact that they could tweet something and be locked up in jail, or that the government with its kind of lifestyle and conservative agendas intervenes in the way they live, their relationships, all this kind of stuff, where a lot of young people, both liberal and conservative, are major concerns. I hope I answered your question there.
Thank you. Zenonas, you want to follow up, or I can proceed?
You go ahead. I have a couple of thoughts, but you go ahead, Giannis.
I mean, what is growing the last years in Turkey, and I'm very familiar with it, and you write and publish many stuff very usually on it. It's the hip hop movement, the musical genre of hip hop that is very popular among the youth of Turkey. I would like to ask you, in political terms, all this resistance through music and through hip hop particularly, what is the exact type of criticism that is addressed towards the AKP government and Erdogan policies? What is the reaction? How would you describe this reaction? What is all about?
Yeah, I think hip hop, as in many places of the world and as in its origins in the East Coast of the United States, has often been, as we know, a vehicle for discontent and for various, marginalized groups or people who otherwise feel oppressed or have a political issue to express themselves. And it's definitely been used that way in Turkey. I mean, interestingly, Turkish language rap began in Germany among, children of German immigrants. And also already coming to Turkey, it had this kind of political valence of expressing a group identity of people who feel, who are minorities and feel marginalized. And yeah, in recent years, rap has been around for a few decades now in Turkey. And there's been various periods of it waxing and waning, becoming popular and sort of becoming underground again. But Giannis, as you alluded to, it's really come back in the last, say, 3-4 years. And it's not all political, of course. Some of it more explicit than others. But I think something about the genre does lend it to expressions of political statements. So, some of the more obvious examples, you asked what the criticisms are. A couple of years ago now, or a year and a half ago, I guess, there were a couple songs you might recall that were released accidentally on the same day, 2 protest hip hop songs. One was this song called Susamam, I Can't Be Quiet or I Can't Be Silent, by the rapper Shanasher and I think 17 other artists, this major collaboration. And that song, for example, really sent shockwaves through the society. Everyone was talking about the song, even people who don't like hip hop were aware of it. Different government ministers critiqued the song and said these people are just trying to stir up trouble. But it talked about everything from the terrible rates of violence against women in the country, to pollution, to the arrests of journalists and the lack of freedom of speech, all this kind of stuff. The other song that came out that same day was by one of the rappers most responsible for making hip hop mainstream again in Turkey, which is Ezhel. And he put out a song called Olay, or incident or situation. And the song was perhaps even more explicitly against the government than Susamam was, and talked about the last 20 years of AKP rule, and talked about the protests, repression, arrests, violence, terrorist attacks, government's failure to address terrorist attacks, various disasters that could have been avoided, et cetera, et cetera. So this stuff pops up at different times, and I think since the Gezi Park protests of 2013, since street protests in many ways have become less possible, the feminist movement is probably the best example of this still street movement. But other than that, we haven't seen the kind of mobilization that's happened since then. So I think pop culture and hip hop specifically become this sort of site for people to, like when the discontent just becomes too much, it overflows in these kind of cultural forms. And I think it's also interesting that it's not always political. I think what Ezhel and some other rappers represent is a kind of new politics. We have, of course, a long tradition of protest music in Turkey. Bands like Grup Yorum, and even older examples from the 60s and 70s. And some of it was, explicitly tied to the Communist Party or the different socialist movements. But this new generation is a little bit more vague, and I think its vagueness is sometimes powerful. It's not associated with one sect of the left or one party. It can be about politics, but it's also about pleasure, it's about fun, it's about living life the way you want to live. And in some ways, I think it makes it more powerful, because if you have partisan music, I think a lot of people who aren't organized on the left already just aren't interested in it. So the fact that maybe the political message is watered down, but the fact that it can reach more people, I think, really makes it a potent weapon.
Thank you. Zenonas.
That's very interesting, actually, and sort of connected to what I wanted to ask before. I mean, we see strange ideological and political dynamics going on in Turkey right now. We see the whole political spectrum moving very much to the right, or sometimes even to the extreme right. And looking at the post Gezi Park period, we could see there a very different part of Turkish society expressing themselves and protesting and pursuing and asking for different things. Would you say that the behavior of the government and how they sort of cracked down on that movement back then, and also in the later years, sort of managed to silence this more, let's say, progressive part of the society, or do they still manage to express themselves in different ways? And perhaps hip hop is one of them. And a second question is this depoliticization of the message? So, the fact that the whole maybe discourse in Turkey became pro-Erdogan, anti-Erdogan, or, it's along broader political lines, not very specific because the problems are so maybe wide or deep, hinders the prospects and the power that this more progressive movement can have in the future. Sorry if I put too much in there, but
no, I'll try my best to answer those questions. That's helpful. Those are good questions. I mean, I think definitely the landscape has changed since the Gezi Park protests. I mean, like I mentioned, doing street protests in the way we had been with massive people filling squares of Istanbul or other cities is pretty much impossible because the government's cracked down so much on protests. And like I mentioned, the one exception is the feminist movement, which has been really strong. But of course, even when feminists march and hold street protests to fight against femicide and other patriarchal policies of the government, they're met with tear gas and batons and everything else. So definitely that kind of mobilization isn't possible now. And that's part of why this stuff has sort of migrated to popular culture, to hip hop, like we said. Also all sorts of sort of more digital forms. And you see this again, sort of sometimes the discontent just overflows and it becomes too much. So for example, a few months ago, President Erdogan had a live YouTube meeting with the youth, or he addressed the youth. It was right on the eve of a major test that young people take to enter university. It determines a lot of things in their lives, and the date was kind of changed last minute, and there was general discontent with lots of things. So, for example, this YouTube chat was bombarded with dislikes, angry comments, so much so that the people hosting it had to take off the like, unlike feature and the comments. And then there was a trending hashtag of no votes for you, saying that, as young people were so discontent that don't think you could count or no vote anymore. So, it's different than actually meeting in the streets or a more intense political organization, but the discontent is there. I think people are waiting for the right moment. In terms of the polarization, it is definitely true that, many aspects of life in Turkey are polarized, politics especially, and the youth in some ways as well, of course. But I think what's interesting about the problems we've talked about a minute ago, about unemployment, discontent with job prospects, job security, feeling like people can't live the way they want to live. So much of this actually transcends political affiliation or the kind of classic secular conservative divide. I mean, young people, basically all young people, except for the very wealthy, are affected by these same issues. And we haven't really seen like a political body or movement yet that can bring people together, young people with the same issues across the political spectrum. But I think that's potentially the hope, and I think it could get there if things don't get better. So I think those kind of classic binaries between different groups in society, especially when it comes to young people, are sort of breaking down, or could break down as we move forward.
That's very interesting. I don't know, Jan, if you have any last questions or comments?
No, Zenonas, I'm pretty covered by all these interesting views Kenan gave us.
Yeah, I thought it was a very, it was a different conversation, stuff we don't often hear about. And it's good to have a deeper insight into the Turkish society and different, parts and aspects of the society that I don't know, for some reason in international media and the Western press are not so prevalent, and you know, we tend to maybe simplify and overgeneralize stuff. So it's good to for sometimes to maybe being transferred into virtually into a country, into Turkey in this instance, and getting a better perspective. So thank you very much for that, Kenan. We hope that we'll have the opportunity to talk to you again as things progress. We hope the best for you and the people of Turkey. And with this, we'd like to wish you all the best, and thank you again very much.
Thanks so much, Zenonas, and thank you, Giannis. It was great talking to you guys. Wishing you the best.
Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us. We'll catch you the next time. Bye-bye.